All right, everyone, welcome. We are glad that you made it on this Wednesday morning and happy to have you all. With that, we're going to jump into some content and get started. So welcome to our session called Engagement and Feedback, where our goal is going to be to dive into who, what, where, when, and how to share perspectives. We're going to share some frameworks that we've used in the past and hopefully have you walk away with something you can use in your role at your organization. And so to get us started, we'd love to do a quick check-in to see who is joining us this morning. And so in the chat, and you could make sure if you are sending a chat, you could put this to everyone in the group. What's one thing you're hoping to get out of today's webinar? And then as you type your response, if you could also include your name, the district you work for, or the role that you're in currently, so we can get a sense of who is joining us this morning. And we'll give everyone about a minute to get our chat responses in, and then we'll jump into some more content. Thank you, Anne. Welcome. Thanks for joining. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you for joining this morning. And for folks who just joined us, if you could just go into the chat and make sure you're clicking to everyone, seeing a few private chats come in. Click this to everyone. What is one thing you're hoping to get out of today's webinar? And then put your name, district, and role, just so we can get a sense of who is in our Zoom room today. Thanks, Stephanie. Thanks, Misty. Thanks, Karen. Appreciate you jumping in. Evelyn as well. John, welcome. Laura and Patricia. Looks like we have a few folks now logging on. Perfect. Keep those chats coming to introduce yourself to everyone in the group and welcome to all. We are going to push forward and introduce ourselves, but like I said, keep those coming, and thank you for those folks who put those in there. Some quick introductions for who is in the room in terms of education elements. My name is Chris Edmonds. I'm a design principal, and I currently live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And prior to jumping into working for Education Elements, I was a teacher and school leader in Brooklyn, New York for a number of years. And I'm excited because feedback was something, was a growth area for me throughout my career, and it still is. So I'm excited to jump in to this work with you all today. And I'll kick it over to my colleague, Evan, who will introduce himself.
Hi, everyone. Happy to be here with you today. My name is Evan Mearshite. I'm a design associate at Education Elements. I live in Washington, D.C., and before I was with Education Elements, I was a sixth grade English teacher and very familiar with giving feedback with students, getting feedback from students, but sometimes working with adults and working in your school teams was always a little bit difficult with feedback. So I am excited to talk about those things with you here today.
Thank you, Evan. And yes, to anybody, New York City, Brooklyn is my home away from home. So thanks for those shout outs in the chat. So quick intro for those of you who are unfamiliar. We are Education Elements, and we're an education consultancy. We work with districts and schools and states around the country. And you can see some data underneath on the bottom of this slide, just to quickly introduce what we do. And we focus on a litany of topics. And today we want to focus on a topic, like Evan said, that is present in all schools, all districts across the country, and that is how to give and receive feedback in a way that can sustain growth. And so the framework we're going to use today for our learning is a framework that we often use, and it's called CPAD. And it involves 5 components. Number 1, a spark. 2, an expand. 3, practice. Then apply, and then debrief. And so the spark is going to be a way for us to start thinking about a topic. The expand will be a way for us to introduce some strategies. Then we'll have some practice and application. One note is the debrief will be on your time after the session, and we'll have ways for you to follow up with us, but that'll be asynchronously after our session together today. And so we'll jump into the spark. And our spark is the following, and we'll use the chat for this. So if you want to double click to make sure everyone is included in this message. But here are some common phrases that we hear in schools, districts, and organizations across the country. Do you have a few minutes to chat? How do you feel that went? Can I give you some feedback? Or you did a great job on X. And all of these comments have to do with feedback and giving and receiving feedback. So our question to get us started here is, what do you feel when you hear those comments? And you can just list some adjectives or some thoughts in the chat, and we'll give everyone about 30 seconds.
Uncertainty. Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, definitely feel uncertainty when you hear some of those things. Anxious, Misty. Yes. Katie, excited. Love to know how things are being received. Awesome. I'm glad that you feel excited to hear that. John feels some dread. I'm seeing a mixture of anticipation, interest, apprehension. Yes, anxious. Somebody, Monica, thinking, is this an evaluation? Absolutely. Some people definitely excited to get feedback. People are feeling worried. Some people eager to hear feedback. And it seems like we're holding a lot of different emotions when we hear some of these things. Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you everyone for sharing and getting some interesting statements here. I think we're kind of all along the spectrum. Someone mentioned it depends on who's giving me this feedback. It depends on my relationship. There it is. And you also mentioned that as well. And the spectrum can move from excited to anxious. And so we wanted to spark this conversation by naming that there is a lot of emotions that can happen with feedback. Today, we're going to focus on how we can make sure that feedback in all cases can lead to some sort of growth. There's a couple strategies we want to talk about with you all that we think can help that. And so thank you for sharing those. And we're going to jump into some of those strategies here. And so to frame how feedback can be perceived, you may have heard of this before, but feedback can be viewed through what we like to call the threat response. And whether the feedback is coming from a positive place or a constructive place, it doesn't matter. Us as humans may perceive it as a threat for a litany of reasons. And so that can trigger some psychological triggers. And you could feel misjudged, ill-used, and sometimes threatened to your core. And so when you feel that threat, it can trigger this fight, flight, or freeze response. And when that happens, all learning and the intake of information can be blocked. And so we want to avoid this. And we're going to dive into what this can actually look like when it's specifically related to feedback. And so the question is, why is receiving feedback so hard sometimes? We like to bucket it into 3 different categories. Number 1, it could be dealt with truth triggers. And what we mean by that is the content of the feedback could be unhelpful or untrue for you as the receiver. And so you might feel exasperated. You might feel a litany of emotions, but it's key in this case that you know your tendencies. And by boosting your self-awareness and knowing your strengths and growth areas, you can help to remedy any of these truth triggers. The next one, and I think a few folks in the chat mentioned this, is relationship triggers. And so this is due to the person giving you feedback. Your relationship with that person is not in a place where their trust is built, where you can receive that feedback. And so this can lead to you feeling defensive and less open to coaching. And so a strategy we like to employ here is working to separate the message from the messenger. And so if there's a space where you don't feel like that person, you have a strong relationship, trying to distill the message they're trying to tell you versus just looking strictly at the messenger. And the last piece here is identity triggers. And this one is a little deeper. But this is feedback, especially for folks who are new to a profession. And I'm thinking like new teachers, new leaders, new principals, but people who may not have a lot of confidence in their role just yet. When they receive feedback, it could be putting them into question in terms of their sense of self. They could be feeling overwhelmed, defensive, or off balance. And so a strategy we like to employ here for these folks is distilling evaluative feedback and coaching feedback, and really focusing on that coaching feedback, because that is how you're going to get better in your practice. Another framework that we like to introduce here is the SCARF model. And we think of the SCARF model as these 5 domains. status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And what this model tells us is these 5 domains activate the same threat and reward response that we rely on for our physical survival. So this sometimes explains some of those strong emotions that we get when we're receiving feedback. The sweaty palms, we start to feel uncomfortable in our chair, and those emotions can overtake us. And so, for example, if in a situation at our organization when we're left out of an activity, we might perceive that as a threat to our status or relatedness to the group. And so research has shown that this can stimulate the same brain region as physical pain. So in other words, our brains are sending us a signal that we're in danger. So it's important to name this and realize that these responses are normal and can happen to any one of us. And so specifically related to feedback, this is how we're going to bucket those 5 domains and give some examples. The first domain that we talked about in that SCARF model was status. And so this involves the status of the feedback giver or receiver. Are they in a higher position than us? Are they a colleague? Because in each of those situations, the feedback is going to be perceived differently. The second one in that SCARF model was certainty. And so this has to do with receivers or givers of feedback not knowing exactly when feedback is going to be given. In an organization where feedback is not normal, this could happen quite a lot. And so it's important to understand when this can take place. The third one that I've seen happen a lot across different organizations is autonomy. And so this plays into the need to participate. And do I have a say in what time of day I can receive feedback, or what class period if I'm a teacher? Or is it a conversation I can have with my coach versus my coach just telling me I need to do X, Y, and Z? Then there's relatedness. And this has to do with our identities as humans. Can I relate to the person who's giving me feedback? Do I feel connected to them? And how safe do I feel when I'm in a room with them? And that's critical to interpreting feedback. And then especially in schools and districts, we see a lot of this play out when it comes to fairness. And I saw this a lot play out amongst teaching cohorts and making sure that we're giving the same feedback and expectations across the board to all of our staff and all of our colleagues, and we're holding people to the same expectations. And so those are some examples of that SCARF model and how it can play out strictly through the lens of feedback. And so some solutions we want to present to you for how you can get around these 5 domains and make sure that you can receive and give feedback effectively. The first one is reframing the experience. So bringing awareness and working against the natural inhibition to run from valuable feedback. And it's sort of building that culture where feedback is wanted and people seek it out. And then one quick piece we wanted to add in here is it should be normalized, this bottom piece, that if you've reached your limits for absorbing feedback in a given moment, at the end of the day, it's been a Friday or whatever it is, you should be able to pause and ask to revisit the conversation. And that's something we want to see at organizations, and that's something you should push at yours as well. We wanted to add that in there. The second one, and is pretty intuitive, but for a lot of us, this can be difficult, especially depending on the role we're in, but building a relationship and putting in the time to know someone so that when you have that constructive feedback moment, that trust is already inherent. And so there's some examples there about how you can build those relationships prior to jumping into some feedback. And the third piece we're going to introduce here is, like I said earlier, just developing a feedback-rich culture. And so just giving it more frequently, making sure that, like we said, it's okay to postpone feedback when someone's not in the right mindset to receive it. And then leadership models. So feedback can go upstream, downstream, but people can give feedback throughout an organization, and it does not just head one way. And so with that, we're going to dive into, we talked about receiving feedback, and we're going to kick it over so we can dive into some ideas about giving feedback.
Great. So Chris has talked a little bit about how people are receiving feedback, the responses that we feel when we receive feedback, but how can we give feedback to people, positive or negative, that isn't going to trigger some of those physical responses in the brain, trigger things that make it impossible for us to feel impossible for us to receive our feedback. So if you are implementing PBIS or something else in your school, you might be familiar with the idea of a ratio of feedback, positive and negative. And research shows that a lot of really high performing organizations have a ratio of a little over 5-to-1 in terms of positive and negative feedback. A lot of people are always chiming in with, I agree with you, I like that idea. Things where you are elevating other people and making them feel like they're bringing good ideas to the table. So when you are offering those negative pieces of feedback, it doesn't feel like that's always the status quo. Sometimes there are pieces of negative feedback that we need to give, but it's important to have a strong ratio of positive to negative feedback to make people, as Chris was talking about earlier, feel open to receiving some of those more negative pieces of feedback. So you all might be familiar with this feedback sandwich. And I know for a lot of my time teaching or a lot of my time as a professional, I always thought, oh, I need to grade someone's paper with this feedback sandwich. Start with something positive, then deliver the negative piece of feedback that I wanted to deliver, and then finish off with another piece of positive feedback. While this is nice and we get a 2-to-1 positive feedback ratio, there are a couple of problems with the feedback sandwich. Number one, I think it's difficult to trust the feedback sandwich if you have been given, you know that you're given a positive piece of feedback on the front end and on the back end, but you know that they really just want to talk about that negative piece of feedback. It's difficult to know the first piece of positive feedback might just be fluff. And so it's hard to trust those positive comments. And I think the second thing is, if you end on this positive note, we're not really talking about a next action step. We're not talking about something that you can move forward with. We're talking about, oh, here's another piece of positive feedback. Well, maybe I want to talk about, I made this mistake. How can I move forward? And it's important to have other pieces or a full kind of feedback conversation and not just end on that positive note. Sometimes we need to think, ask questions, provide potential next steps moving forward. So as Chris was talking about earlier, we want to make this feedback receivable. We don't want to trigger those physical pain response receptors in the brain. We don't want people to feel those sweaty palms or feel nervous about their feedback. We want people to feel comfortable and not have those alarm bells going off in their head. So we're going to talk about a couple of quick steps or quick things that you can do to make your feedback receivable. The first one here is start with a micro yes. And these kind of go back to what our opener question was. And I noticed that in the chat, Jennifer said something that it depends on how the statement is framed, right? When someone's asking you about feedback, it depends on how someone frames the statement. And it's important to frame it kind of A, in a positive way, and B, in a way that someone knows exactly what you want to talk about. Can we check in on blank? Do you have time to talk about blank? These are examples that frame things in a way that doesn't seem negative. I don't immediately think, oh, I really messed up on something. And I know exactly what we are going to talk about. This is going to reduce any type of surprise that I feel if Chris and I are all of a sudden having a conversation about something that he wants to talk about. Right? Some feedback that I might be getting. I'm not caught off guard, or I don't feel like I'm taken aback or in a defensive stance kind of in our conversation, because I'm getting that micro yes to start, and it's reducing that level of surprise. Let's take a look at the other piece, right? And I really like this idea of naming what a camera can capture. And what we mean by that is we want to come with very clear examples or data points or things that we can point at and say, hey, I really liked how you wrote this. I really liked the language that you used in this email, specifically these 3 things. And it's also important to avoid blur words or words that are really kind of might trigger an emotional response. If I get an email that says, hey, the last email that you sent was too sloppy. Your proposal is unrealistic. These are things where not only do I not understand exactly why my email was sloppy or my proposal was unrealistic, I also don't really understand how am I supposed to move forward from this? I don't know exactly what these words are, and this makes me feel a little bit more attacked. So it's important to bring specific examples, right? So when you're observing a teacher, when you're working in a group, to gather those data points to be able to say, hey, you did a really nice job on blank. Here are a couple of things I noticed. Being as specific as possible, I think reduces someone feeling like they're being personally attacked, and we're simply talking about the facts and we're talking objectively about what we saw. So it's important to always name what that camera can capture. And talking about being blurry or being specific, if you aren't specific, it's really tough to make feedback actionable. And if we take a look at this image here, kind of this matrix with the 4 different suits from playing cards, we're going to notice and kind of think of this idea as the hearts and the clubs are blurry, right? These kind of the rounded shapes, whereas the spade and the diamond being pointy, those are specific pieces of feedback. The reds are positive and the blacks are blurry. And it's really important, whether you're giving positive or negative feedback, to be giving specific feedback, something that you can take back, something that the receiver can take back and try and change, or maybe even look for themselves. It's hard to look for your email being sloppy on the next email you send, but it's easy to double check, spell check. It's easy to make sure that you have all of the links in your next email. Making your feedback actionable, even if it is negative, and making it specific is very important for making it actionable. Excuse me. So we've talked a little bit about this, but there are a couple of ways I think to make things actionable. And the first of which is to kind of make this impact statement, talking about what was the impact of what you did, right? If we take a look at our first example, the person is saying the work that they did helped the team become even more efficient. If we can see what the outcome of someone's actions were, again, we're not judging someone specifically. We're taking a look at what happened as a result of their response, and we can now look at making that feedback actionable. Oh, you did something and it led to great results for the team. Or because your email was late, the team got delayed and everything was a little bit slower. Focusing on what the result of someone's actions were, help them maybe change the next time and make more actionable feedback. The other piece of this, I think, is feedback is a two-way street. Chris was talking about this a little bit earlier, right? Where you are having a dialogue with someone. Someone's not just sitting and receiving your feedback all the time. They should be a part of that conversation as well. And so asking for their input, learning how they felt about a situation, questions like, how did you see this situation? What can we do differently going forward? Asking for their input makes this a much more collaborative process and makes it a team effort. I think that this raises how people feel about the feedback, and we can feel a lot more positive, like we are working towards a collective goal if we're having that two-way conversation, asking those questions and talking about impacts that people or that our actions made.
So Evan just went over giving feedback, and we talked about receiving feedback. And now we want to distill it down to even more specifics and talk about some frameworks that we've used in the past and we've seen districts and schools use in the past that we found to be very effective. And so we're going to go over 3 different frameworks. And I'm sure a couple people in here have used these or worked with these frameworks before. And so the first one is radical candor. So if you've used this framework for feedback, you can just let us know in the chat just to see if people are familiar. But even so, we have some examples here that we think might be helpful in terms of radical candor. And so radical candor is succinctly caring personally while challenging directly. And it's thinking about giving feedback and being kind and clear, but also being specific and sincere. So it's a balancing act. And when you hit the sweet spot, your feedback can and will lead to this profound change and growth over here. And so the way that we think about radical candor is along these spectrums. And the spectrums along the x-axis deal with challenging directly and silence. And on the y-axis, it deals with caring personally and then just not caring about the person at all. And you'll see that when you move along this spectrum, what happens when you care personally but are silent, or when you don't care and are silent, you'll see all the outcomes that can happen throughout this spectrum. But our goal is to be in this top right quadrant as much as possible when we are giving and receiving feedback. And so we wanted to give some examples of, these would be non-examples, excuse me, of candid conversations. And these would fall not in the radical candor bucket in that top right. And so the first one, which is in that bottom right spectrum down here, obnoxious aggression. And so this could also be considered like brutal honesty or praise or criticism that isn't delivered kindly. And a humorous example that we have here is you're telling somebody, your breath stinks, you should use some mouthwash. Well, 99% of the time, that's not going to make the person feel great, and they're probably going to feel judged, especially if it's in front of a group of people. So we would call that obnoxious aggression, meaning that you're challenging the person directly, but you're not showing care for that person and how they feel. The second bucket is called ruinous empathy. And this is different because this means you are caring for the person because you're in that top area of our spectrum, but you're remaining silent and you're not challenging them. And so this deals with praise or criticism that is not specific enough. And as Evan mentioned earlier, this could be considered fluff or stuff that actually will not impact or cause growth. And so an example of this that we want to avoid is down here at the bottom. You're doing such a good job. Keep up the good work. That statement is ambiguous. That statement, you could go in 10 different directions as to exactly what good job means. So we want to avoid that lack of specificity. And the last one is the manipulative insincerity. And so this one, you are not showing care for the person and you're remaining silent. So this deals with being insincere or flattery to a person's face, but then when you're not speaking to them face to face, you'll say things that are different from what you said to them. And so an example of this is this comment down here. I'm really sorry about what I said in that email. You were right and I was wrong. And so if you're not truly meaning that statement, just saying that will not lead to that growth that you want to see in that relationship. And so to be solutions oriented, we wanted to consider these statements and then think about how we could move these further along the spectrum to that top right. And this is what we think to be radically candid. For that first one, not saying somebody's breath stinks. We want to avoid that. But instead saying, please stop interrupting in meetings. It's distracting and rude. Now, while that could be considered a little harsh, if you have that trust and relationship with that person, that message is clear, succinct, and you're naming the impact of their actions. The second non-example was the ruinous empathy. And so the initial statement was, you're doing a really good job. Keep up the good work. So instead of saying that, just being specific and really diving into the weeds of what exactly they're doing well. So the example could be, that report you put together is really impressive and will allow us to clearly analyze this information. And the last one is the manipulative insincerity. And so instead of saying, I'm really sorry, you were right, I was wrong, saying, that's definitely something I'll take into consideration. Thanks so much for sharing. Number one, you're acknowledging their feeling and impact, but you're also taking some time to process yourself before you apologize or name next steps. And so we feel like that comment will lead more to that radically candid spectrum in that top right. And so that was our first framework. And the second framework we want to introduce builds on that first one, being radically candid. And we like to call this one nonviolent communication. And the reason that it builds on that is because it is an overlaying framework. So if you're radically candid, that's great. And you want to be in that top right. But we have a process that we think works really well within this top right spectrum. And that is the nonviolent communication. And so once you're in this top right, here is a nonviolent communication framework that we think works well. And it just sort of breaks down how you could have these conversations in an easy, simple way. The first part is observation. So just naming exactly what you saw. Similar to how Evan mentioned what you can see with a camera, being very explicit. And so an example here is I didn't get a response to my email. Very clear and not vague. The second piece is feelings. So based on that observation, how do you feel or how did that impact you? And so an example is I didn't get that email. That led to me being frustrated, confused, perplexed, irritated. You get the idea. The third piece is pivoting to what you need or what met or unmet needs do you have based on those feelings. And so following that same example, you could say, I need a timely proposal, need to get a proposal or deliverable out by X date. And then to wrap up the nonviolent communication, then you move to requests and ask for exactly what you need. Can you commit to doing this by X date? Can I have this to you by EOD today? But we like to use this framework because it eliminates some biases that could happen when you're in being radically candid. And so we like to use both simultaneously to make sure that we're leading to that positive growth throughout our conversations.
Great. And let's take a look at our third and final strategy. And this is going to be our long acronym here, SBIQA. So SBIQA is a little bit different than the other strategies that Chris showed us. This is talking a little bit less about maybe how something made us feel, but we are still taking some of the core principles of giving feedback. We're still taking a look at that camera shot, and we are still suggesting actions moving forward. In the middle, okay, perfect. Sorry. Great. Taking a look at this first example, when we look at SBIQA, it is incredibly important to have all four parts. In this first example, we're only discussing the situation. Once we don't describe the behavior, our feedback kind of goes off the rails. After talking about what the situation was, I wouldn't know what feedback I'm really receiving. I wouldn't know what the excellent job was and what elements of personalized learning did I implement really well. How can I do that again? I might not know how to replicate my behaviors if they aren't necessarily named for me. Let's take a look at a stronger example, filling this out a little bit. In the same way, we start with the situation, but now we're able to describe the behaviors, students knowing exactly where to go and having all of the materials. That means that knowing the behaviors that I practiced, I could do this and I could repeat this over and over again, right? And then thinking about that impact, right? Having an impact of, oh, students were able to share what they were working on and why. Now kind of my whole exercise is coming together. I'm feeling reaffirmed in what I am doing, and I am feeling more motivated to continue this practice of stations. Great. Let's take a look at another non-example that does a nice job talking about impact and asking a question, but we're missing the first couple of pieces. It's really important to have the situation and the behaviors named. If we don't have these named, now I'm just feeling like this is a personal attack. I'm not getting that snapshot, that camera shot that we've talked about a lot today, those specific details or examples. I see this and I think, I was being observed. I don't know what they're talking about with confusion. To me, it seemed like the students got what they needed to get done, right? And so being able to give that snapshot of the behaviors is incredibly important for our teachers. So let's take a look at how we can alter this feedback and make it a little bit stronger. So we see this final one. Now with the situation and the behaviors named, we have the principal, the instructional coach, whoever was observing this teacher. Now all of a sudden, the teacher can be like, oh, you're right. I didn't really notice or remember that there were a few students who were kind of sitting and waiting around, right? It's important to have someone else explain exactly what they saw. A teacher might have been so busy with 10 different things trying to get stations to work that they saw, noticed, and forgot that there were students who didn't know where to go. It's really important, and we see this great piece of feedback with the behaviors and then the action step at the end. So being able to name what the impact is and the behaviors or what they saw associated with it is incredibly important. And then we want to end just with a little quote here, thinking about these 3 different ways to deliver feedback from Kim Scott, the author of Radical Candor. Relationships, not power, drive you forward. In thinking about when we are giving feedback, we're trying to build strong relationships in our schools, in our districts, and building those relationships is what's going to lead to the change that we want to see, the positive impacts that we want to see in the school. Together, we're moving a lot further and a lot more consistently than if everyone is moving independently with missed lines of communication.
So we talked about giving feedback, we talked about receiving feedback, and we talked about 3 distinct frameworks that we think work really well in terms of giving and receiving feedback. So we've talked a lot about that. We want to give you some time to think about how or what you can take back to your practice and bring back to your school, district, or organization. And so we're going to jump into the practice part of our CPAD model here. And for the practice part, it's going to be independent, and I'm going to have us put a link. Thank you, Evan, for putting that link in the chat. So in the chat, you will click on a link that'll bring you to a page that looks like this, and you'll just click copy document. And this will be just for you. So we're not collecting these. This is only you can see this, but it's a space for you to capture any notes up top here. What things are you taking away? For each section, you can fill out each section, you can fill out one, completely up to you. And then down here is the creating a plan for action. So whether it is a 1% shift, whether you want to try one thing in your next meeting, or you want to revamp your feedback protocol for your entire team, it's up to you. But we're going to ask you that you capture that plan down here for creating a plan of action. And yes, I will get that link to you in the chat. Seeing a few folks asking for it. Oh, thank you, Evan. And we're going to take about 3 minutes. And if you have questions for Evan or I, feel free to chat us. I'm going to play some soft music in the background. 3 minutes, though, to just practice or plan which ones, what you want to take back. And Shirley, if it's not working for you, let me send you a private chat, and I'll try to get you a new copy. Oh, I see what's going on. Hold on, let me try this. What about now for Evelyn, Patty, and folks? Do you see it now? Perfect. That was on our end. So it should be there. And if you have any other questions, feel free to shoot us a chat. And thank you to those folks who already sent that chat to us. Got it with requesting access. We'll get that to you. All right, everyone, we're going to come back in about 20 seconds. I appreciate the grace and patience from folks as we got some of the access issues there figured out, but I'm glad that people were able to access it, and we'll come back in about 20 seconds. All right, so even if you're not finished with your plan of action, that's perfectly fine. That was just for you to capture thoughts and next steps. And feel free to finish that asynchronously after our session together if you would like to. And so we're still working through our CPAD model, and now we're moving on to the apply. And we like to think of it more of like a plan to apply, but for acronym sakes, we like to put that plan to up top there. But would love to hear in the chat. And if people could just go through make sure you're clicking on everyone when you send this in. But if you could share what you're committing to try and bring back to your classroom, to your school, to your district, to your organization, whether it's something small or whether it's something large when it comes to feedback. Would love to, for people, if they feel comfortable, to go ahead and share in the chat. Appreciate folks sending those private messages in. A lot of stuff about the radical candor model and making sure that we're pushing also that nonviolent communication within that model, seeing that come in. And thank you for that, for person who sent me that privately. Perfect. Yes, be specific, making sure that you're naming, like Evan said, exactly what you're seeing. And I like that idea of naming what a camera can capture and making sure that that ambiguity and those questions don't arise. Yep, and we will send you all these frameworks too. I got a question about, can we get the frameworks to dive into more details? Absolutely. And yes, stay away from the dreaded feedback sandwich. We want to avoid that and avoid the fluff to make sure that people know that we're being authentic and real and honest with them. Keep those coming in. And thank you for those folks who are sharing those comments. I appreciate that. And I appreciate your thoughtfulness. And so with the debrief, like we said, this is going to be after our session together. And we want to open up some space for you to be able to ask questions and let us know how things are going and follow up. And so the way we're going to do that is just adding a time to reflect. And so if you want to add some time on your calendar in 3 to 4 weeks, let's say you're going to try a framework or you're going to introduce a framework to your teachers, just checking in 3 to 4 weeks and seeing how that's going. And then we're always here to support you along the way, whether you want to send us an email, you'll get our emails too in the follow-up we send. You can also tweet us if you are currently using Twitter. We are active on Twitter and we love to see people engage with us there. And you'll see our company Twitter handle. You'll also see my Twitter handle there. So feel free to reach out to us that way as well. And so with that, that takes us through the CPAD process and that takes us through our presentation. And so we wanted to leave you with a couple quick informational things that you can check out after our session. But you'll see a QR code on your screen. That is a QR code to our blog. And we spend a lot of time researching, getting stakeholders, interviewing about feedback. So if you're interested in this topic, definitely subscribe to our blog. And there's some key information there that you will probably find helpful. And all that info is there in that QR code. And I'll leave it up there for about 10 more seconds for folks who want to take a quick picture. And if you don't have your phone around you or you're not a QR code person, we'll send this via email as well to everyone. And a couple other quick announcements for folks who are interested is we have some Spring Forward Cultivating Educator sessions coming up. And you'll see the website that you can log into to register for those dates. The dates are currently here. So our next one, well, we have one today on May 18th, but if you want to go to that, you can check it out. And then we also have one on strategic planning coming up on June 21st. So if you're interested in that session in June 21st and you have an open time on your calendar, definitely check out this website to register or to send it to folks who you think would be interested. And last but not least, we wanted to just say thank you. We appreciate you stopping by today. We appreciate your engagement, and please stay connected. The bit.ly link to our slide deck is here, and you'll see all our information. And we hope you have a wonderful Wednesday, and we hope to talk to you soon. Thank you so much for stopping by.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate you.